Not every nation with which the U.S. has close and cordial relations is going to be a democracy. That's just the cold, hard truth, as the geopolitical strategist Toby Keith would say. But America's friends and the recipients of American aid should at least not routinely violate the most fundamental human rights, such as freedom of religion. 7 years ago, when I was serving as a commissioner on USCIRF, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, I went to Egypt to see how the government was doing in this regard. Recall that in 2012, Mohamed Morsi, leader of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, was elected president. A, quote, bloody period, unquote, ensued. And that's in the words of the Coptic Christian Patriarch, Pope Tawadros II. I'm quoting from a meeting I had with him in Cairo. In 2014, there was a military coup, and Army Field Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi assumed the presidency. Tawadros told me he had good relations with President Sissi. Quote, discrimination is decreasing, he said, adding, but slowly. I left Egypt hoping the trend would persist, but USCIRF's latest Egypt report suggests my optimism was not justified. The Egyptian government, the report finds, continues to systematically restrict freedom of religion or belief by enforcing laws, policies, and judicial decisions that repress non-Muslim and Muslim religious minority communities. Mariam Wahba, a research analyst here at FDD, published an enlightening article this week in the Free Press, Barry Weiss's excellent online newspaper, highlighting what she calls the brazen attacks on Christianity taking place in Egypt and across the Middle East. Mariam is with us today. I'm Cliff May, and I'm glad you're joining us too, here on Foreign Podicy. Welcome, Mariam. Good to see you. Start by telling us, if you would, about, I guess, what I might call your Egyptian and American journeys.
Well, it's good to be with you today, Cliff. I feel a little bit like a rock star sitting across from you. Um, Absolutely. So I am Coptic by birth and I'm Egyptian by birth, but American very much so by choice and unique opportunity, I guess you could call it. My family came to the US seeking a better life for our family, and we've been in the United States ever since. And I like to jokingly say, I'm American, of course, but I self-identify as a New Yorker, which is home to one of the largest Coptic communities, Coptic American communities across the U.S.
How old were you when you got here?
I was a child. I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. But as some people know the story, the first few years you immigrate to a country, you very much feel like a visitor, a guest. So it wasn't until a little bit later, as a young adult, that I very much began leaning into who I was becoming as an American and shedding my Egyptianness while retaining my Copticness.
Did you speak English before you got here? Probably
Not
not.
at all. Not at all. Maybe a couple words, but I was definitely the kid in ESL classes well into high school.
What's interesting is you got here, you say you're around 7 years old, and of course you speak with no accent whatsoever. What you find is that if a kid comes over as a teenager, the older they are, more likely to have an accent, right? Like Henry Kissinger never got rid of his accent, although I'm not sure that was a pose in order to be the intellectual German professor, even though he'd speak like this, right? But if you come in before you're age 10, you can get perfect English with the pronunciation and all that. Yeah.
Well, you know what they say, when you're not practicing, when you're not learning a language, you're unlearning it. So,
Oh,
sitting there not speaking not speaking Arabic for long periods of time, you definitely unlearn it in the process of trying to learn English.
right. But your Arabic's still pretty good, right?
I can get by for sure. I can order food, ask for the bathroom, the important things.
This is important to note. Once upon a time, there was a time when Coptic Christians, who I would say, you correct me if I'm wrong, the indigenous people of Egypt had their own language. And that language has sort of been lost, hasn't it?
Yeah, so this is a great start to our conversation. So the Coptic language is particularly interesting to me because it's technically a dead language. Of course, the Coptic people use it in a lot of liturgy and religious ceremonies, but it's not something a lot of people speak. In recent years, there's been a campaign to revive the language, actually modeled after the Hebrew revival campaign of
Oh,
the early
right.
Zionist movement, which is a fascinating story in itself. But there's more and more young Copts, particularly young diaspora Copts, who are trying to revive the language. And I will add one quick note about Coptic as a language. It's actually the latest form of the ancient Egyptian language, kind of intermixed and intermingled with ancient Greek and Demotic, and it's a fascinating language to study.
Is it still used in the liturgy of the church?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I was in church last Sunday and we used it. Not everybody in church particularly understands what is being said, but if you go to church every Sunday for years at a time, you'll kind of be able to speak and recite it as the service goes along.
So the priests probably know a lot of Coptic language. They do.
Yeah, it's part of their training. So when a priest is ordained, they go into the desert in Egypt, and I assume, I wouldn't know, but I assume that some portion of their training is spent learning that language.
And just talk about how old the church is, the Coptic church is in Egypt.
Sure. Don't get me too riled up, but
No, it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating. I'll take that. Yeah.
So this is a great place to start with the Coptic language. So the word Coptic is actually a Greek word, and it means Egyptian, and it's what the ancient Greeks used to call the ancient Egyptians. So there's kind of two versions of Egypt that a picture comes to mind when people hear the word Egypt. They think of hieroglyphics and the pharaohs and ancient Egyptians, and then if they've been on vacation to Egypt, they think of the modern day Sunni Muslim state of Egypt. And I think of the Coptic people as kind of the bridge between those two visions of Egypt. So around 40 to 60 AD, St. Mark the Evangelist traveled to Alexandria, where he began to preach, and he built the Library of Alexandria and the tower that is infamous. And because the ancient Egyptians had similar ideas and themes of an afterlife and a forgiving God, they quickly began to convert to Christianity. And for the next 5 or 6 centuries, Egypt became a predominantly Orthodox Christian, Coptic country. And you had numbers estimated about 85% of Egypt at that time was Christian. And then you have the Arab invasion happened 5th, 6th, 7th century, and the Christians of Egypt had essentially a couple of choices. You could die at the sword, you could convert, or if your family was wealthy, you could pay what is called a jizya, which is a protection tax under Islamic Sharia, and you'd be allowed to practice your own faith with some restrictions.
As a
so that is correct.
And just for people to know, a dhimmi means essentially a second-class citizen. Just so we know, yeah.
Right, yeah. I mean, dhimmi entails so many things. Dhimmiism as a status renders you to a second-class citizen, but I could argue, that it's even a little bit less than a second-class citizen. Second-class citizens share some overlap with first-class citizens in terms of rights and abilities to practice one's civic duties. Dhimmis are a separate and completely isolated social class during that time and perhaps even now than a regular citizen of a modern-day Muslim state.
I'll tell you a story on me, but a little bit. I remember I was with a Coptic friend, acquaintance, many years ago. I didn't know nearly as much as I do now, not that I know a lot now. And I think I referred to him, this may have been on a panel or something, as an Arab. And he kind of turned to me, and I probably put his hand on mine, and he said, "Let me correct you. I speak Arabic. I am not an Arab. The Arabs are the people who came from Arabia and conquered my people. And there are many ways in which we may have been Arabized, but I'm not an Arab, and I don't think of myself as an Arab, and it's incorrect to call me an Arab." And I'll just add this: he's right, and I was wrong. Although, and this is something I want to just explore with you for a minute. Keep in mind, what I was thinking of was that in 1958, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the dictator or president, I forget, of Egypt, proclaimed Egypt as the United Arab Republic. The United Arab Republic. And by the way, it was also, he united it with Syria, with which it has no border. You'd only have a border with Syria and Egypt if you wiped Israel off the map from those two sides, which was tried and placed in 1948, tried in 1967, tried in 1973. Then Egypt could unite with Syria as an Arab republic. I shouldn't, just for historical sake, I'll say that union ended in 61, after a coup in Syria, and Syria withdrew. But the name United Arab Republic persisted until 1971. So what's really interesting to me here is, in a way, Egyptians are not have been Arabized, but are not Arabs. And yet Nasser says, I'm going to be the leader of the Arabs. Egypt is, and you'll see all the time people say, oh, Egypt, it's the leading Arab nation in the world. So my confusion was, I would say, at least a little bit justified. But you might want to talk a little about what was going on there and hasn't stopped entirely.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a fascinating story, and I've been a perpetrator of the same act to many of my friends, as your friend and colleague have done to you, and it's a very common mistake. I mean, we look Middle Eastern, we speak Arabic, we are Arabized in every sense of the word. We celebrate Arab, quote unquote Arab holidays and eat Arab food. So it's a very easy mistake to make, and I think it's a sensitivity for Copts and other ethno-religious minorities, particularly because our ancestors worked so hard and endured so much to ensure that we do not become Arabized.
Right.
So it's a bit of a sore spot. But to transition to Nasser for a sec, at the time, Nasser was one of the architects, arguably the architect of Pan-Arabism. And he saw himself as the leader of the Arab world. I mean, he used to have these Theodore Roosevelt-esque, fireside chats that would be broadcast across the entire Arab world, which is actually, fun fact, why a lot of non-Egyptians can understand Egyptian Arabic better than they can on any other dialect of Arabic, because they, their grandparents and their parents remember hearing those Nasser broadcasts. Arabism is fascinating to me for a couple reasons, and I had a little obsession with it at some point in my young adult life, because I think a lot of Christians in the Middle East at some point dabble in Pan-Arabism because they see it as a way to shed their dhimmi status. In fact, the architects of Pan-Arabism as an early ideology were, I think, like 3/4 Christians. They were trying to find a means in which they didn't have to become dhimmis no more, or be dhimmis no more. They were like, well, if I could just say I'm an Arab and I already speak Arabic and I eat the Arabic, what if I just, forget the part where I'm Christian and just worry about that part on Sunday mornings exclusively, and for the rest of the 6 days a week, I can just become an Arab, and that way I can have my voting rights, I can serve in the military, I can so and so and so on. So Pan-Arabism is this fascinating idea that eventually failed, but was at some point very interesting to the Christians of the Middle East.
Yeah, and 2 points. The same can be said about Baathism. Baathism is a sort of kind of fascist ideology, not terribly well developed. You had both Iraqi Baathism. Saddam Hussein was a Baathist, and you had Syrian Baathism. Doesn't mean they get along or saw the world the same. But prominent in Baathism, again, were Christians who said, okay, we can all have the same ideology and then it won't matter. Frankly, it's a little like Jews who adopted communism, saying, okay, if we're all communists, then we're all comrades, and I won't be oppressed or persecuted as a Jew, particularly if I'm secularized. It's a little bit of the same thing. As you say, Pan-Arabism and the idea of an Arab world uniting and rising up failed, and of course has largely been replaced by Pan-Islamism, right? That idea. Now, that again, for Christians can't be quite on the same level, although there are quite a few Christians who attempt to do that. So something like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PLFP, it's a Marxist-Leninist Palestinianist organization, and so there were Christians in it. I think George Habash, a Christian, began it. If my memory's not great on these things, but it's not. But it's better than what I had lunch yesterday, right? Am I right on this? Yeah,
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
If we're wrong together.
Okay. Okay. Anyhow, kind of fascinating. All right. So, next, tell us about the piece you had in the Free Press. Very good piece. It focuses particularly on a 1,500-year-old monastery in the Sinai desert. Tell us what you were writing about and thinking about there.
Absolutely. So there is this monastery in the depths of the Sinai Desert on Egyptian territory called the St. Catherine Monastery. And the St. Catherine Monastery is important theologically, historically, for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is that it is the oldest, longest, continually inhabited Christian monastery in the world, meaning that from its founding to today, it has not been abandoned and it has continued to serve as a sanctuary of prayer, worship, refuge from all kinds of awful things that have happened in and around it. The Sinai is an interesting place in Egypt, and perhaps we can get to it next. But the piece goes into Egypt's war against St. Catherine's Monastery, and it's been a slow and quiet war. But I have a hard time defining it as anything but a war, because Egypt is essentially attempting to nationalize St. Catherine's, make it state property. And it's an interesting thing to happen because we've seen similar things happen to Christian places of worship across the Middle East more aggressively in the last couple of decades. Of course, the Hagia Sophia comes to mind, in Turkey.
In Istanbul, yeah.
Correct. Yeah, taking a place that has been a Christian site. It's been converted throughout the centuries based on who was ruling Turkish lands, from a church to a museum to a mosque to something else. But up until it was converted about 2 or 3 years ago, if my memory recalls correctly, it was transformed from a Greek Orthodox church/museum into a mosque. And I'm not accusing the Egyptian government of attempting to do something similar, and it's certainly not a one-to-one comparison. But what's at stake at St. Catherine's is the Egyptian government trying to take it and turn it into essentially a tourism site that the Egyptian government can use and leverage for its own non-religious reasons after 1,500 years of continuous use and upkeep by these monks in the Sinai Desert.
Well, and there's some risk to it for a number of reasons. You mentioned the great library established at Alexandria. What happened to that library?
Do you know? Is this a quiz? It was burned.
I think it was
correct?
destroyed, wasn't it?
It was burned. Yes.
Yeah, it was burned. By Muslim invaders, if I remember.
That's
correctly.
correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So that just gives you extra reason to worry about this. And you also mentioned that the St. Catherine's right? Yeah,
Mhm.
has a great manuscript collection, which scholars from all over the world want to utilize. And so the way you do that is you make a request of the government and say, can I come and examine these manuscripts and work from them? And go ahead. What's happened recently?
Well, so up until probably 2023, the monks have for 1,500 years been the arbitrators of who gets access to the manuscripts. And scholars from all over the world, including prestigious institutions here in the US, would submit a request to the monks and tell the monks, I need these manuscripts for this reason on these dates. And the monks would make a decision based on that request of whether they'd approve it or not. And for the most part, they would approve dozens of research projects and access to these manuscripts. In 2023, the government took away that autonomy from the monks and said, you no longer have the authority to say who gets access to the manuscripts and when and why. And since then, multiple scholars have talked to me and said that we've requested approval, and there's been approval requests in the queue that have been ignored. In fact, the ministry itself, which gets the requests, has not been able to communicate a reason for why there's been no response on dozens of requests to the monastery. And the manuscript collection, the question here is why is it important? Why can't they check out another manuscript at a different monastery? Although that's not the point. The manuscript collection that St. Catherine houses is the longest continuous uninterrupted manuscript collection in the world.
Wow.
Meaning it rivals even that of the Vatican's, because although the Vatican's is larger and maybe spans a little bit longer, the Vatican's manuscript collection is interrupted at certain points, whether it's years of interruption, decades of interruption. St. Catherine's is uninterrupted from the moment it was founded till now. And that is really quite remarkable.
And you mentioned this was that the monks there are about 25 monks, you believe, who are still there at the St.
Correct.
They're Greek Orthodox, not Coptic. There's a relationship there. I mean, they're just there's a difference, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Greek church and the Coptic church have a close relationship, and there's a lot of Greek Orthodox church infrastructure on Egyptian soil. So the Greek government, the Hellenic government, and the Egyptian government have had a pretty cordial relationship when it comes to upkeeping historically Greek Orthodox institutions on Egyptian soil. Meaning that the monks, while they are on a visitor visa to Egypt, except the archbishop, who was granted Egyptian citizenship back in the 70s, they're technically visitors. They're visitors in the monastery that is historically Greek Orthodox. So this issue has put some strain on the Greek Egyptian relations, and they've been in dialogue for a couple of weeks now since the court ruling in May, trying to come up with a solution for reconciling Egypt's court ruling that essentially sees the monastery nationalized, become Egyptian property, and the fact that it is not Egyptian property and belongs to the Greek Orthodox Church, which is closely intertwined with the Hellenic government. So there's more here at stake than even just history, preserving cultural heritage, and the rights of Christian institutions.
It also reminds us that, say a century ago, Egypt, at least in the cosmopolitan centers like Cairo and Alexandria, was a very diverse country, much more so than it is today. I mean, Jews and Christians of different denominations and people, a lot of Europeans. I mean, it was very, it was, if you like diversity, Cairo had it in a way that I don't think it quite does today.
Absolutely. I mean, you think about, even in the early 19th century, you think about Alexandria and what a hub for culture and scholarship that was. You had Armenians, Greek Orthodox, you had Jews, of course, up until they were expelled in 56. And you had these flourishing societies and hubs, both in Cairo, but really my mind always goes to Alexandria because it's a port city and it really absorbed so many different kinds of people and allow them to flourish. You still have like the Coptic quarter in Cairo. At some point, you had the Greek quarter and the Armenian quarter and the Jewish quarter, which had the Geniza. So there's so much that's been lost as a result of what's happening to Egypt.
What was the Geniza? What is that?
The Geniza, perhaps I'm using the Arabic word for it, but it's a place that houses a lot of Jewish manuscripts, old Jewish.
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about? Am I saying it wrong?
I do.
Okay,
yeah.
Ginza or Geniza, something like that.
Yeah. And by the way, people may know this, but some may not. Alexandria was named for Alexander the Great. It was not named for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
She wishes.
All right. Now, technically, Christianity is a protected religion under Egyptian law. You've written about this. I know you've talked about this. And it's disappointing to me as somebody who was there and really kind of, as I said in my introduction, kind of left optimistic. The government in Cairo under Sissi, it's not shielded Christians from attacks. And we should talk about those attacks because what's happening to the church you're talking about, the monastery you're talking about, is terrible. But terrible things are also happening to the Coptic Christians, to the Christians who have lived there for 1,500 years.
Absolutely. I mean, if I think of the Christian issue when it comes to Egypt, the Coptic issue when it comes to Egypt, as sort of a litmus test for what else is happening in the country. If you want to get to the bottom of, is the economy doing well? How's civic engagement doing? You could just Google, Coptic Christian attack and hit the news tab and see when the latest attack was, or at least the latest attack that was reported on. And that'll generally give you a sense of how stable Egypt is. Attacks under Sisi have been far and few. I'm careful here to kind of put a lot of blame on the Sisi government because, of course, in the wake of the Arab Spring, we had a Muslim Brotherhood president, Mohammed Morsi, in power. And this situation, as the quote you read earlier on from Pope Tawadros, it was a bloody period of Egyptian history, because you had the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood in charge, and they did not care so much for the Coptic people, to put it to put it mildly. Sisi is a pragmatic leader, and he understands that when you have a minority population, the government ought to at least present itself as one that is willing to protect its people. Attacks on Christian homes, businesses, and churches happen semi-frequently, and the role of the state here, as I see it, is making sure that perpetrators understand the risk one incurs when one wants to act out on their extremist tendencies. It's hard to just say, like, only Muslim Brotherhood operatives or only Islamists attack Christians. Everybody is culpable of attacking the Coptic Christians in Egypt. It happens between neighbors. I know it because I saw it and lived it. I think the role of the Sisi government ought to be so that anybody who thinks about setting a church on fire or robbing a Coptic home or kidnapping a Coptic girl or woman ought to know that the price to pay will be heavy. And I think that's where the Egyptian government has failed.
Yeah, because these things do happen, and they're often not punished. The capturing of Egyptian women. Also, if you want to, repair a church, that's not so easy to do in Egypt,
Right.
I understand. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you need a license to change a light bulb, to fix a sink in a Coptic church in Egypt. And up until very recently, you actually needed the president himself to sign off on that license, which is a form of persecution, if I do say so myself.
And it should, one of the reasons I thought it might be better. I think this is in a column I wrote after I went to Egypt for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Is you had, as we were discussing, Nasser, who said by action, but maybe in words, I am the Arabic president of an Arab country. Sadat was a peacemaker, but he still said, I am the Muslim head of a Muslim country. Sisi has said, I am the Egyptian head of Egypt, of an Egyptian country, much more inclusive.
Right.
But it's not clear that he's acting that way entirely. I think a lot of people also thought once he came to power, because he was so anti-Muslim Brotherhood, he would be anti-Islamist and, of course, and anti-Hamas. And it's not clear to me that he was seriously anti-Hamas, because what we now know is that huge amounts of weaponry, we believe, went from Egypt into Gaza over the years since 2007, when Hamas took over Gaza in a kind of mini civil war. There was one election, I guess in like 2005 they won, never had an election after that. The Israelis had withdrawn from Gaza in 2005. 2007 they take over, and that's it. But then they start to build up this massive amount of weaponry and dig these tunnels, which, Israeli intelligence should have known all about, obviously didn't. But I do think there were those who thought, oh, Sisi will never allow that kind of thing to happen. We can trust that Sisi will maintain the Philadelphia corridor, that's the border between Gaza and Egypt, and not let weapons come in. And for some reason, you might want to speculate that on this. If you don't, you don't have to. He didn't do that, either because money was being made from smuggling, or because he was intimidated and wasn't going to stand up to Hamas and say, I'm not going to help you get weapons in. Who knows? But that corridor was porous over those years.
Right. The tunnel issue has been waxing and waning out of headlines, and I remember it was quite a revelation in the early days of the October 7th war, as the IDF was entering Rafah and seeing just how much tunnels were running between Gaza and Sinai underground. And Dr. Jonathan Shanzer and I wrote quite extensively about this several times as they were being uncovered. Look, I think, like I said, Sisi is a pragmatic leader, and he was very much anti-Brotherhood. He is anti-Brotherhood. I could make an argument for why he's anti-Hamas, but I think he's often put in really sticky situations where he's not able to maneuver in the ways he wishes. So that's part of the first. That's
not able because of forces in his government, in the military, Islamists in the country. Muslim Brotherhood is still a force. He hasn't entirely neutered it there.
I think the answers to the question is parts of everything you just said.
Okay.
I also think Sinai is such a behemoth of a place to understand, because it's not a place that is heavily populated. It's not a place where, up until the October 7th war, Egypt had a large military presence. Of course, they would go in and out when they were tackling ISIS, and there was a huge ISIS problem in the Sinai, but it's not a place that's exactly on Egypt's radar pre-October 7th as a place that requires a lot of attention. There's also the problem of the Bedouin tribes that are pro-Hamas that live in the Sinai. So while I might speculate that Sisi is anti-Hamas and those tunnels never should have been built under his watch and remained operational, Sisi himself is not, standing at the Rafah border with a gun making sure the tunnels aren't built. There is a population there that might have ulterior motives that the Egyptian army cannot control at all times and cannot have oversight over at all times. And I will have to, give a little asterisk here. I'm not being sympathetic to the Egyptian state. These tunnels should not have built. I'm trying to paint a picture of how this happened, rather.
Yeah. And two things I want just listeners who might not know to understand. One is, in addition to the tunnels under Gaza, there are tunnels from Gaza to Egypt. That's the two. Two is Hamas. It's not unfair to call Hamas the military wing of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza and with the West Bank. It's also fair to say, just so people understand that. You also, that's also before we go. It seems to me that after the attacks of October 7th, once the war began, it was clear that the civilian population of Gaza, I'm not saying they were anti-Hamas, I'm not saying they were uninvolved, I don't think that's true, but there should have been, the Egyptians should have said, we want to do what we can to protect the people of Gaza. After all, Gaza was part of Egypt, a protectorate of Egypt, a possession of Egypt, up until the 1967 war, when Israel was attacked from Gaza by Egypt. And at the end of that war, as people should know, Israel took Gaza, not from the Palestinians, but from Egypt, took what we now call the West Bank, Judea, or some people do, Judea and Samaria, not from a Palestinian authority, but from Jordan, which had claimed it and actually renamed it the West Bank because they weren't about to call it Judea and Samaria. At that point, once it was clear and it was clear pretty soon there was going to be a war, Egypt should have said, well, Sinai is a big, vast place. We're going to open for refugees so they can get out of the way of the fighting, so they can be fed and have adequate housing and medical care. We'll let them cross over into the Sinai. And they didn't do so. And maybe you want to talk about why Egypt didn't do so. And by the way, I'm jumping ahead, but the U.S. should have put serious pressure on Sisi that you have to do this. Otherwise, you are helping Hamas do what it has done, which is use the civilian population of Gaza as a human shield, which they are still doing to this day. Hamas is under Gaza City, and the only way that the Israelis can get at them is to go through the civilian population, or as they're talking about, move the civilian population out of Gaza City. And the safest place would still be to Egypt, which is right there. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I mean, how different our world would be
yes.
if that would have happened. If Egypt would have been the leader of the Arab world that it claims over and over to be. The refugee question is a big one, and I think it's one we're still trying to answer as it devolves into a bigger question. I think we're in violent agreement on that. The White House should have certainly placed massive amounts of pressure on Egypt in the early days of the war to take Gazan refugees in anticipation of the Israeli offensive in retaliation for the atrocities of the October 7th Hamas attack. That didn't happen, and we live in a different world. And I think folks have been making the same point over and over again, even as we're now two years into the war. Should Egypt take these refugees? They have a responsibility to do so as the war is ongoing. And I think we would have been living in a completely different world if the White House had done its job and Egypt had done its job by taking those. Maybe we would have lived in a world where Hamas had been defeated and those refugees would have been able to return to Gaza under civilian rule, not under Hamas rule. There's kind of a lot to dig into here. I think the place I want to start is, why did Egypt not do that? Obviously, anybody who has watched Egypt even from afar knows that the Palestinian issue is a pillar of Egyptian foreign policy, both on the regional stage, but even on the international stage. It's, a topic on the agenda every time an Egyptian foreign minister meets in Washington, or a Washington official goes to Cairo. It's a standing agenda item. And it's one that's embedded into the Egyptian psyche. So even in the days after October 7th, I've watched and continue to watch Egyptian social media, trying to track what the sentiment is among the Egyptian population. We're looking, at 120 million people, the most populous Arab country in the region. That's a large amount of people to try to understand how they're thinking and how they're influencing their government. The Egyptians were not sympathetic to the Israelis even before the offensive began. Shocking, I know. But there was a sense of joy, unfortunately, amongst the Egyptian public, generally speaking, that the Palestinian people were rising and fighting the Zionist entity, as they call it. And that was really upsetting. I thought we had moved past the point where the Egyptians were becoming more and more pragmatic, especially in the wake of the Abraham Accords. Like, you saw Egypt wanting to engage with Israel more, wanting to be the UAE in a lot of ways, because it was like the OG UAE in terms of making peace with Israel first. And it was trying to bring its people along. And the October 7th attack and how Egypt reacted to it kind of destroyed and derailed that process. I think trying to answer the question of refugees in the moment, should Egypt take Gaza refugees right now? I think the answer is no, unfortunately, for two reasons. One, Egypt does not have the political capital it needs to absorb 2.1 million Gazan population. Its economy is in dire strait. It can't pay for basic things. Its debt ceiling keeps rising and rising and rising. It owes massive amounts of debt and continues to seek investment from international organizations and European countries and so on and so forth. So there isn't a lot of incentive for Egypt, even having money put on the table in front of it, to take in this massive population. So that's the practicality.
Well, just say one could imagine Qatar or Saudi Arabia or others saying, we'll pick up all the checks for the refugees, and we'll throw in a few, I don't know, 20 billion, 100 billion for you too, which will help you. I think there have been offers like that floated, and the Egyptians have still said, no, we'll leave the money on the table.
Absolutely. Yeah, there have been several times where Gulf countries have made that offer. I believe there was an alleged report of the US making a similar offer to Egypt at one point, and it was rejected. And we can get into why I think that was rejected. The second part of it is also moving 2.1 million, let's call it break even, 2 million Gazans into the Sinai. What does that mean for Egypt logistically? Sinai is a hotbed for terrorism, particularly ISIS, but we've seen all forms of Islamist groups operate within ISIS, and Egypt is quite fearful that a Hamasnik or two sneaks in amongst those 2 million Palestinian civilians. And now we have missiles being launched from Egyptian territory, the Sinai Peninsula, into Israel proper. And talk about catastrophe. Boy, would that be a catastrophe, and a big one. Talk about what that does to Camp David. Talk about what it does to an already strained Israel-Egypt relationship. I mean, I think the risks for Egypt are just so astronomical that they can't entertain it. And then the last thing I'll say before I shut up here is Egyptians are a prideful people. They're people with a long and storied history. And when they put their foot down on something, it's hard for them to walk back from it. And I think that is an under-realized aspect of Cairo's calculation when it comes to this refugee problem.
And I just want to emphasize something embedded in your remark, which people should realize, and that is that Hamas would have no difficulty whatsoever finding common cause with ISIS or with Al-Qaeda, because essentially their ideologies at least overlap. They're both Islamists. They're both jihadists. They both believe that any land ever conquered by Muslims remains for eternity an endowment, a waqf from Allah to the Muslims, and that it is their duty to destroy, displace the infidels who control that territory. That's their belief, and and so many people don't get that motivates Hamas, ISIS, Al Qaeda. They may have other theological doctrinal differences, but they're not great. They're more things like, should we declare a caliphate now, or should we wait? Who is the legitimate heir to Mohammed in the world, Shia and Sunni? There's all kinds of doctrinal differences, but the basic idea of Islamic supremacism, which the Coptic Christians have felt for centuries, that remains. And that is a key part of what makes it hard to get to any kind of peaceful coexistence in the world. Now, and this brings me to something I want to talk a little bit with you about, which is the state of Christians in the Middle East more generally. Because part of the problem for Christians in the Middle East is there are, of all the countries, and there are, depending on how you define the Middle East, 20, 30, 40 countries, not one is a Christian country, by which I just mean a majority Christian country. The number of Christians in Egypt, it's what, 9-10% of the population at this point?
Give or take, correct.
Give or take. I think Lebanon at one point had a Christian majority, probably. No longer does, because Christians left Lebanon. They left for the U.S., they left for South America, they left for Africa, where a lot of the merchant and mercantile class, I remember when I lived in Africa, were Lebanese. Your family left for good reasons. As you say, there's a big Coptic population in New York City. There's a reason they left their ancient homeland. And by the way, I should say the only place where the Christian population appears to be rising is Israel. It's the only place.
Yep.
And yet, hey, exactly. So I don't know. It's one of the things. I mean, I'd like to talk about a few of the countries and their the Syrian in Syria. We don't know exactly what's happening, but it's a pretty difficult and dangerous time for we Christians in Syria. I've been hearing. I don't know. Most people have been. I've been writing a little about this, about the plight of the Druze in their ancient homeland in southeastern Syria, around Druze Mountain, all that, and where they're been under attack by Islamist and jihadist forces, and the Druze very badly. But there are Christians who will have lived among the Druze there as well, and they're also endangered and persecuted now. Tell me what you know about Christians in Syria.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's start in Syria. So obviously the ethnic minority that's stolen the headline in the last couple of weeks in Syria are the Druze. And our wonderful colleague Ahmed Sharawi has done a wonderful job of covering the recent violence and what it means. There's a couple of things that we can extract from what's happening with the Druze that can be predictive factors in what we ought to look for when understanding Syrian Christians' role in this new Syria. The one thing that's been important in watching the events unfold with the Druze is how much it has highlighted al-Shara's lack of control over his forces. I have said and analyzed, I guess you can say, that it is not in al-Shara's interest to persecute the Christians. It is not in al-Shara's interest to go after the Christians by any means. He's a new leader of a deeply fractured and embroiled country coming out of 14, 15 years of a civil war. He needs as many friends as he can. So it is in his interest to court the Christians and make sure that they feel represented. How that translates to him not having control over his own forces and the forces that he does not control is where I predict some trouble when it comes to the Christians, as has come true with the Druze. So I don't predict that the new Syrian government is going to actively go after Christians, because it's not in their interest to do so. Where trouble might lie is precisely with those same factions within his newly formed militias that he doesn't control. And they're ideologues, and they move there, a lot of them, because they're not Syrian, they're foreign fighters. They move there because they subscribe to the Islamist ideology that told him so many times over and over again in their recruitment process and their indoctrination process that you are here to establish an Islamic caliphate and fight for Allah, and you're going to have 4 wives and hundreds of children as living on Muslim land.
And maybe some Christian slave wives too.
Exactly. I mean, who wouldn't love that? It's a great deal if you ask me.
I'm glad
So
you
I
said that
think
about
there's
me.
going to
I'd
be
be in trouble.
so there's going to be a competing interests. I mean, Shara needs to do one thing, and his forces that he so obviously does not control want and or promise something else. And I think that's where there's going to be discrepancies we're going to see play out.
Yeah, I don't know, agnostic about what he can't do and what he won't do, and it may overlap. His background is Islamist. He may think it's perfectly justified for these forces to show the Christians and the Jews who's boss, and there's one way to do it and show them that they are not equal citizens in this caliphate. But maybe he can't do it too. I mean, that's the more generous view, and I'm just not sure we have sufficient evidence on any of that. But it's a very dangerous time for the Christian minority there. Turkey, we mentioned that there you have you had an important church made into a mosque. I mean, Erdogan was, up till then it had been a museum. When I was there in Istanbul years ago, it was a museum, which is kind of okay. That's what it's going to be, if it's fine. But this is sort of saying, okay, we want to show you who's boss here. And we're not going to be. We're going to be clear about this. People should know Istanbul was once Constantinople, the capital of Byzantine Christianity, until it was conquered by a Muslim army, and then thereafter it became the capital of the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman Caliphate. That's important to realize. And there was also a population transfer between Greece and Turkey. And we think people don't understand about that. People think, okay, so the Greeks went back to Greece and the Turks went back to Turkey. No, the Christians from what we call Turkey, Anatolia. Turkey is called Turkey because it was conquered by Turkish tribes from Central Asia. This was imperialism and colonialism. Let's just understand. So Christians from Turkey, even if they didn't speak Greek, went to Greece. And Muslims living in Greece, even if they didn't speak Turkish, went to Turkey. It was a population transfer. Anyhow, I'm going on, but I do think it's an interesting and instructive history.
Absolutely. I mean, it's all part of the puzzle in trying to understand what's happening. Okay, so to circle back to Turkey, I think the conversion of the Hagia Sophia into an operational mosque has been the defining moment for the plight of Christians in Turkey. And I've brushed up on some of my numbers right before we started speaking, and different Christian organizations have estimated something like a 6-fold in attacks against Christians in the last 2 years under Erdogan. And there's a number of reasons for this, but of course, the number one reason is Erdogan and Turkey's move towards more fervent nationalism, embedded or bleeding from like old school fashion Ottomanism. And when you have a population that's being pushed or is pushing itself towards such a fervent nationalism as old-fashioned Ottomanism, of course you're going to have higher percentage attacks against Christians. Of course you're going to have more churches vandalized. The most painful thing that I've, and I'm speaking here anecdotally, that I've seen in the wake of the Hagia Sophia conversion is these beautiful ancient icons in the Hagia Sophia that have survived, wars and atrocities and massacres, are now being like scratched off by visitors and prayers. Like, beautiful Saint Mary icons are now, kind of like play toys for people coming in and out of what is the now mosque. So I think at a surface level, that is telling of where we're heading when it comes to Christians in Turkey.
And I'll leave this to you. Do you have any other thoughts on Christians in, I don't know, Iran, Christians in Lebanon, Christians anywhere else in the region? What anything that just occurs to you that's worth a little commentary?
Sure. I'll go very briefly on Iran, and maybe we can do Israel last.
Okay.
Iran is a interesting country to understand its Christian population because it's not a monolithic Christian population. You have Armenians, you have Assyrians, you have all kinds of Christians. In the wake of the 12-Day War, Iran began cracking down more fervently on its Christian populations. In fact, some 53 of them were arrested in the days immediately after the war ended because they were accused of being Zionist Christians. Of course, the easy accusation. Some of them were made out on bail, but there is this association within the Iranian regime, within the Islamic Republic regime, of Christianity and the West, whether it be Zionism or America or anything in between. There's that association, and I think it's used to target Christians. The other very interesting thing about Christianity in Iran is there is a booming underground church movement, a spiritual resurrection, I guess I can call it. Different church groups have estimated something like between 2 and 6 million Iranians have converted to Christianity and are practicing underground in home churches over the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, it's a country of about 92 million people, so 2 to 6 million is a small number, but I think it's telling of where the country is headed spiritually. And there's been really incredible work being done in smuggling Bibles and other Christian texts into Iran. I know this one story anecdotally of obviously if an official sees a Bible, they're obligated to confiscate it and burn it. People are smuggling in voice Bibles, like recordings of the Bible on little old style iPods and similar devices. So I think that is a very interesting trend to watch in the coming months and years to try to understand where the Iranian population is heading.
And you wanted to say something about Israel to finish up on that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, to your point, Israel is the safest country in the Middle East for Christians. It is the only country where the Christian population is growing. Are there problems? Absolutely. There's problems everywhere with regarding to any ethno-religious minority in the Middle East. But what makes Israel different for Christians is the Israeli government has an actual vested interest in protecting the Christians and making sure they're well integrated into Israeli society. Last fact before I wrap up is after October 7th, more and more Christian Israelis are enrolling into the IDF than ever before. And I think that is an incredibly positive trend that should be encouraged.
So last subject, I guess, for today, St. Catherine's Church. I don't think it's, and I know you don't think it's interfering in internal affairs for the U.S. to say, we're very disturbed about this. Religious freedom is an important American value. That's why we have things like a U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. What I said in my introduction, we don't expect every country that we're friendly with to be a Jeffersonian democracy or even an imperfect democracy, but some basic human rights we should kind of insist upon if they want our friendship, our respect, and particularly our aid, our military aid, and our humanitarian aid. I want to give it, but I also want them to, show a certain. So here, we shouldn't turn a blind eye. We should probably make clear that the aid they're getting is somewhat in jeopardy if they continue along the path that they have begun, as you describe it in your article in the Free Press. That's, I guess, what I would say.
Absolutely. And not only we should express that, we should make it clear that it is in our law, codified law in our foreign military funding, that these are conditions that need to be met if you want that full $1.4 billion package.
Well said. Mariam, it is always a pleasure and an education to talk with you. And so I'm glad to have done it today on this subject, and I hope to see you in the office very soon again, both of us. Until then, thanks again for being with us, Mariam.
Thank you for having me, Cliff.
And thanks to all of you who have been with us today for this conversation here on Foreign Podicy.